The storm howled like a living thing across the open plains, snow whipping in frantic spirals that bit at Elias Boone's face as he urged his horse forward through the drifts. His coat was stiff with ice, his breath a ragged fog, but he didn't slow, not when his gut told him something was wrong. It had been a long, brutal winter with little cause to leave the solitude of his ranch. Yet tonight, an unease had dragged him from his hearth and into the blizzard, the kind of unease a man learns never to ignore. Through the white haze, a dark shape emerged, a broken wagon, half buried in snow. Its axles splintered as if it had struck the rocks and been abandoned. Elias swung down, boots sinking into the freezing powder, and scanned the scene with sharp, storm-gray eyes. At first there was nothing but silence, the world muffled beneath the storm's fury, until a faint, strangled whimper reached his ears. He turned, heart pounding, and saw a small figure crumpled beside the wagon, barely more than a shadow beneath a torn blanket. Elias dropped to one knee, brushing snow from the tiny, blue-lipped face of a girl no older than 9. Her skin was pale as moonlight, lashes crusted with frost. And when he touched her cheek, it was icy beneath his calloused hand. He stripped off his coat and wrapped it around her, muttering hoarsely that she'd be all right, though she was far past hearing words. Scooping her into his arms, he rose and carried her to his horse, mounting with practiced ease despite the added weight. She stirred faintly, a weak sound escaping her throat, and clutched at something in her fist. Elias glanced down, and through the blowing snow he caught the glint of metal. A ring tied to a leather string looped around her thin wrist. His breath caught like a fist around his heart. It was a simple gold band, worn and familiar, identical to the one he had placed on his bride Lily's finger the day they wed, 3 years and a lifetime ago. A sharp ache surged through him, nearly breaking his control. Lily had been lost to him in a fire that consumed half her family's homestead, a tragedy Elias never fully understood but had mourned every day since. He stared at the ring, the storm raging around them, and questions burned hotter than the cold. How did this child come to wear Lily's ring? Was it possible? No, he couldn't even dare to hope. He urged his horse onward, jaw clenched, determined to get her to warmth before the storm claimed them both. By the time they reached his cabin, Elias's muscles burned and the horse was lathered, steam rising from its flanks. He kicked the door open, bringing the girl inside, and laid her on a pallet near the fire. The warmth began to seep back into her limbs as he worked to coax life into her with blankets and broth. Slowly, painfully, her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the exact shade of blue he remembered in his dreams. When she whispered her name, Grace, it was a ghost's voice carried on the crackle of the fire. Elias's chest tightened, his heart beating like a drum. Grace, a name Lily had once spoken of, a younger sister he'd never met. The girl's small hand clutched at his sleeve, and with a sudden burst of strength, she rasped a warning that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Men, she gasped, her gaze wild. They're coming back. Elias rose slowly, storm-gray eyes narrowing, his hand going to the revolver at his hip as a lifetime of silence and grief hardened into a single, fierce resolve. Whoever had left this child to die in the snow was about to learn what it meant to awaken the wrath of a quiet man with nothing left to lose. The wind rattled the cabin walls like angry fists, while Elias crouched beside Grace, his hands working swiftly to stoke the fire higher, every crackling ember pushing back the chill that threatened to steal her breath. Her small frame trembled beneath the heavy quilt, her lips moving without sound, until finally a whisper slipped free, fragile as a snowflake. Elias leaned closer, his storm-gray eyes narrowing as he caught the single word. Lily. His heart lurched, his breath catching hard in his throat, the name like a ghost rising from the grave. Slowly, he reached for her wrist and turned it gently. The flickering firelight gleaming on the gold band tied there. It wasn't just similar. It was the very ring he had slipped onto Lily's finger on their wedding day, a promise forged in love and sealed by tragedy when the fire had taken her 3 years past. He had buried his hope with her ashes. Yet here it was, glinting in the trembling hand of a child who should have been a stranger. His voice, rough with disuse and shock, asked her where she had gotten it, but her glassy blue eyes only filled with tears. With halting breaths, Grace spoke of running through the snow, of men whose faces were like wolves, of fire and shouting, and her sister's voice screaming for her to run and never look back. Elias's hands went rigid, every muscle in his body straining against the storm of emotions raging inside him. Sister. The word cracked through his mind like a bullet. Lily hadn't died alone in that fire. She had been trying to protect Grace. Grace's story tumbled out in fragments, barely held together by exhaustion and fear. A wealthy land baron named Colt Marris had been feuding with Lily's family for years, claiming their homestead sat on land he meant to control. One bitter night, Marris sent his riders to burn it to the ground. Lily had hidden Grace beneath the floorboards, forcing her to flee through the snow while she stayed behind to distract the men, buying Grace's life with her own. Tears stung Elias's eyes as he listened, memories of Lily's laughter and gentle touch stabbing through him like knives. The fire had been no accident. Her death had been a murder. Grace's sobs racked her small body as she clutched his sleeve, begging him not to let the men find her. Elias wrapped his coat more tightly around her, his voice low but steady, a promise forged in steel. No one will harm you again, he vowed, and they will answer for what they've done. A sudden sound cut through the storm, the distant whinny of horses, followed by the faint jangle of tack. Elias's head snapped toward the door, his every instinct sharpening. Grace froze, terror widening her eyes as she whispered, "They found me." Elias grabbed his rifle from the mantel and moved to the window, peering into the swirling snow. Dark figures emerged through the white haze, 3 riders hunched low in their saddles, their outlines blurred but unmistakable. Marris's men. They had tracked Grace all the way here, and they weren't coming to talk. Elias turned back to Grace, his storm-gray gaze fierce. He scooped her up and tucked her behind a heavy oak chest, pressing a finger to her lips. "Stay quiet. No matter what you hear, don't move." Grace nodded, trembling, clutching the ring like a talisman. Elias straightened, the weight of his revolver and rifle suddenly familiar and welcome. For years he had been a man of silence and mourning, but tonight the quiet rancher would become a storm of his own, and before dawn, these men would learn why the West still whispered his name in fear. The door shuddered beneath the force of a boot, snow swirling inward as 3 riders burst through like shadows, ripped from the storm, their faces half hidden beneath scarves crusted with ice. Elias was ready. His rifle cracked before the first man could raise his weapon, the shot echoing like thunder in the small cabin, sending the outlaw sprawling backward into the snow. The second man roared and charged, a wild blur of movement, but Elias sidestepped, swinging the rifle stock into his jaw with bone-breaking force. Grace crouched behind the oak chest. Her small hands clamped over her mouth to keep from screaming as the chaos raged around her. The third rider dove behind the overturned table, firing wildly, splinters of wood flying through the cabin as Elias rolled behind the hearth, his storm-gray eyes locked on the shadowed figure. The smell of smoke and blood mingled with the icy wind, turning the room into a battlefield. The second outlaw staggered to his feet, blood streaming down his face, and lunged at Elias with a knife. Elias caught his wrist, twisting hard until the blade clattered to the floor, then drove his elbow into the man's throat. He fell choking, clutching at his crushed windpipe. The third man cursed and tried to flee, bolting toward the door, but Elias's revolver barked once, the outlaw collapsing into the snow just beyond the threshold. Silence crashed down as suddenly as the fight had erupted, broken only by Grace's muffled sobs. Elias's chest heaved, his breath harsh in the cold air, his mind already racing ahead. Marris wouldn't have sent just 3 men. This was a scouting party, a test. The real storm was still coming. He knelt beside Grace, lifting her gently from her hiding place. Her face was pale and streaked with tears, but her spirit had not broken. She clung to his neck, whispering through shuddering breaths that she'd heard one of the men call Marris by name, swearing that he would come himself to finish what his riders had failed to do. Elias's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his beard. Colt Marris had always been a greedy snake, but to hunt down a child, to burn a family alive for land, that was a sickness beyond greed. Elias carried Grace to the hearth, wrapping her in blankets while his mind churned like the storm outside. Jonah Pike, his oldest friend and trusted ranch hand, would have to be warned. Jonah had men and resources, and he'd stand with Elias against Marris. But Jonah's ranch was 2 days' ride through dangerous country, and the snowstorm showed no sign of easing. Elias checked his supplies, low on bullets, lower on food. Staying put would mean certain death when Marris returned with more men. Leaving now was their only chance. Grace watched him with wide, terrified eyes as he saddled the horse and packed what little they had. When she asked in a trembling voice if Marris would catch them, Elias crouched beside her, his storm-gray gaze fierce with promise. "Not while I draw breath," he said, and for the first time since he found her, Grace's lips trembled into the faintest fragile smile. As they rode out into the blizzard, Elias kept one hand steady on the reins and the other on his revolver, every sense tuned to danger. The cold bit deep, but it was nothing compared to the fire burning in his chest, a mix of grief, rage, and a fierce determination to protect this child, the last link to Lily, and the truth buried beneath ash and lies. Somewhere behind them, Marris's men were regrouping, their tracks already filling with snow, erasing the evidence of murder even as new blood waited to be spilled. Snow pelted Elias's face like shards of glass as he urged his horse through the storm, Grace wrapped tightly in his coat and clinging to him with frozen fingers, her face buried against his chest, while the wind howled like a pack of wolves behind them. Every hoofbeat felt like a countdown to disaster, for he knew Marris would send more men, faster and better armed, once the 3 Elias had killed failed to return. The land stretched endlessly before them, white and merciless, but Elias's storm-gray eyes scanned the terrain with a hunter's precision, seeking signs of danger while recalling every hidden trail he had learned in his youth. Grace stirred, whispering Lily's name in a fevered dream, and Elias's jaw tightened, memories striking like blades. He remembered Lily's laughter, the way she had stood beside him on their wedding day, wearing that very ring now tied around Grace's wrist. And he remembered the day he lost her, the fire consuming her family's homestead, while he fought through smoke and flames, only to be dragged back by Jonah before the roof collapsed. He had believed her gone forever, her body turned to ash among the ruins, but now the truth burned through him with a clarity sharper than grief. Lily hadn't just died. She had fought to save Grace, giving her life so her little sister could escape Marris's wrath. Guilt and rage fused into one unbreakable vow as Elias rode, his mind already shaping plans of vengeance even as he focused on survival. By dawn, the storm eased enough for him to spot a rocky outcrop that offered shelter. He dismounted, boots sinking deep into the snow, and lifted Grace into his arms, carrying her into the narrow cave where the wind couldn't reach. She stirred weakly, whispering of a hidden path behind her family's land, a place Lily had spoken of where they could have escaped if only there had been time. Elias realized Marris would know of it too. And that was where the outlaw would strike next, seeking to cut them off before they could reach Jonah's ranch. He fed Grace a small piece of hardtack, forcing himself to eat nothing, then wrapped her in blankets and whispered that she was safe, though his heart thundered with doubt. As she drifted back to sleep, Elias cleaned and reloaded his weapons, every click of metal a promise to Lily's memory. When the first pale light of day touched the snow outside, he mounted again, riding hard along a narrow ridge where the wind carved knife-edged drifts. By midday, tracks appeared ahead, fresh, heavy, and too many to count. Marris's men were close. Elias veered into a side canyon, doubling back to confuse them, his mind racing with tactics from the wild days before he'd turned his back on violence. Grace woke fully then, her blue eyes wide with fear as she asked if Marris would hurt them like he hurt Lily. Elias's voice was low, steady, unshakable as iron when he swore that Marris would never touch her, that she was under his protection now. As night fell again, they reached the ridge overlooking Jonah's valley, smoke curling peacefully from the ranch house below. Relief surged through Elias, but it was short-lived. The flicker of campfires on the opposite slope revealed Marris's gang already closing in. Trapped between salvation and slaughter, Elias tightened his grip on Grace and whispered to her to hold on, because the fight for their lives was only beginning. And before this was over, Marris would learn the price of crossing a quiet man who had lost everything. Elias crouched low against the icy ridge, his breath slow and controlled as he studied the campfires flickering like evil stars on the opposite slope, each flame marking another of Marris's men lying in wait. Grace clung to his side beneath his heavy coat, her small frame shaking not from cold, but from fear, her wide blue eyes reflecting the orange glow of the enemy below. Jonah's ranch lay just beyond the valley, so close Elias could smell the faint wood smoke carried on the wind. But Marris had anticipated his route and set a trap that left no path forward without bloodshed. Elias's mind raced, recalling every hunting trick, every outlaw ambush from his darker days, while grief for Lily pressed like a weight on his chest. Marris hadn't just stolen his bride. He'd burned away Elias's hope, and now he was here to finish what he started by taking Grace too. Elias shifted, his storm-gray eyes narrowing as he counted silhouettes moving around the campfires. 6 men at least, maybe more hidden in the dark. Outnumbered, low on ammunition, and burdened with Grace, he knew a direct fight would be suicide. Grace whispered his name, voice trembling as she asked if Lily had been brave when she faced Marris. Elias swallowed hard, memories of Lily's final moments cutting deep, and told Grace that Lily had been the bravest soul he had ever known, that her last act had been to save her sister. That truth hardened his resolve like tempered steel. As darkness thickened, Elias formulated a plan born of desperation and cunning. He would draw Marris's men away from the valley by making them believe he was retreating, then circle back through the canyon's hidden trails to reach Jonah. He tucked Grace beneath a rocky ledge, pressing the revolver's cold barrel into her palm and teaching her in a low, urgent voice how to fire if anyone but him came near. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded fiercely, clutching the weapon with both hands. Elias kissed her forehead, a rare tenderness breaking through his stoic mask, then slipped into the night like a phantom. Moving silently between the rocks, he fired a single shot into the air, then ran hard towards the canyon, his boots kicking up snow. Shouts erupted behind him as Marris's men scrambled, thinking they had cornered their prey. The chase that followed was a deadly dance through moonlit ravines, Elias doubling back, setting false tracks, and picking off stragglers with cold precision. The storm-gray eyes that had once only held sorrow now burned with purpose as he became the hunter once more. By the time the gang realized they'd been tricked, 3 of their number lay still in the snow, and Elias was already racing back toward Grace. But Marris was no fool. As Elias crested the ridge, his blood went cold. 2 riders had stayed behind, their silhouettes framed by the firelight near the ledge where Grace hid. He sprinted, a silent shadow, as Grace raised the revolver with trembling hands. One outlaw reached for her, sneering, but before Elias could fire, a shot cracked the night. The man fell, Grace's eyes wide with shock at what she had done. The second rider turned, snarling, only to be struck down by Elias's bullet. He swept Grace into his arms, whispering praise and comfort even as his heart thundered with rage and pride. Together they fled into the darkness, leaving Marris's dwindling gang howling behind them. As the first pale light of dawn touched Jonah's ranch, Elias saw Jonah himself riding hard to meet them, rifle in hand. Salvation was within reach, but Elias knew Marris would not rest until either he or Elias lay dead. With Grace safe for now, Elias prepared for the final reckoning, his vow burning like fire. Marris would pay for Lily's blood, and the grave he'd dug for others would be his own. The sun broke through the clouds in sharp golden shafts as Elias rode hard across the valley, Grace clinging to him, her small face buried against his chest, while Jonah thundered toward them from the opposite direction with 2 of his best men at his side. Relief flashed across Jonah's rugged features when he saw Grace alive, but it was quickly replaced by grim determination when Elias shouted over the pounding hooves that Marris and his riders were on their trail. Jonah didn't need more explanation. He'd known Elias long enough to read the unspoken fury in his storm-gray eyes. Together, they reached the ranch and ushered Grace inside, where Martha, Jonah's wife, wrapped her in blankets and pressed warm broth into her shaking hands. Elias crouched before Grace, his voice low but fierce, as he told her to stay hidden and trust Martha no matter what happened outside. Grace nodded. Clutching the revolver, he returned to her, her small fingers white-knuckled with determination. Outside, Jonah and Elias quickly laid out their defense. Jonah's men moved to secure the barn and corral, overturning wagons to create barricades, while Elias scouted the ridge, calculating Marris's approach. Snow glittered like shards of glass under the rising sun, the peaceful beauty of the land a cruel contrast to the violence about to erupt. Elias's thoughts kept circling back to Lily, to the life they'd planned together that Marris had burned to ash. He'd buried his heart with her, but now that Grace was here, alive and needing him, that buried heart beat again with purpose. Jonah caught Elias staring toward the horizon and muttered, "This ends today, one way or another." Elias gave a single nod, his silence heavier than words. The first distant gunshot cracked the air like a warning. Then the thunder of hooves rose as Marris's gang swept down the slope, their silhouettes stark against the snow. Elias took position beside Jonah behind the barricade, rifle braced, breath steady. Marris rode at the front, his dark coat billowing, his cruel smile visible even from a distance. When the gang closed within range, Elias fired the opening shot, dropping a rider from his saddle. Chaos exploded. Bullets tore through the air, wood splintered, horses screamed. Jonah's men held their ground, returning fire with grim precision, but Marris's numbers pressed hard. Elias moved like a ghost, each shot finding its mark, his storm-gray eyes cold and unyielding as he cut through the attackers. Marris shouted orders, fury twisting his scarred face as he realized this would not be an easy victory. Then a cry from the cabin pierced the roar of battle. Grace's scream. Elias's heart stopped cold. He whirled to see two riders breaking past the barricade, heading straight for the cabin door. With a roar that ripped from deep in his chest, Elias vaulted the barricade and charged, his revolver spitting fire. One outlaw fell, but the second dismounted and grabbed Grace, dragging her into the snow. Elias's world narrowed to that single sight. He dove, tackling the man, their bodies rolling through the icy slush. The outlaw raised his knife, but Elias's hand shot up, grabbing his wrist and twisting until the blade clattered free. A single, brutal punch ended it. Grace sobbed, throwing her arms around Elias as Jonah's shout rose behind them. The gang was retreating, Marris fleeing into the trees. Elias rose, clutching Grace close, his chest heaving. This wasn't over, not yet. Marris had escaped again, but now Elias had more than vengeance driving him. He had Grace's trust, Lily's memory, and a promise burning in his blood. He handed Grace back to Martha, his storm-gray eyes blazing as he turned to Jonah. "He won't stop until one of us is dead," Elias said, his voice low and final. Jonah nodded grimly. "Then we finish it." Together they saddled fresh horses and rode into the shadowed forest, following Marris's trail to end the war before nightfall. The forest swallowed Elias and Jonah as they rode into its shadowy depths, the muffled drum of hooves blending with the whisper of wind through the pines. Marris's trail cut a jagged line through the snow, fresh and deep, proof he had fled in haste, but not in panic. Elias's storm-gray eyes scanned every broken branch and churned drift, reading the signs like scripture. Marris was clever, leaving false trails, doubling back, trying to turn hunter into prey. Jonah's voice was low and urgent behind him, warning they were riding into a trap. But Elias didn't slow. This wasn't just a chase. It was the culmination of 3 years of grief and rage, every heartbeat carrying the memory of Lily's laughter and her final scream. Marris had taken Lily, burned her home, hunted Grace like an animal, and now Elias would carve justice from his hide. They followed the trail deeper until the air grew still and heavy, the silence too perfect. Elias reined in, lifting a hand to halt Jonah, and slid from his saddle, crouching low. Ahead, a clearing opened, the snow unmarred except for a single set of hoofprints leading straight through the middle. Too neat, too easy. His gut clenched, an arrow hissed past his ear and buried itself in a tree. Gunfire exploded from the surrounding trees as Marris's hidden men revealed themselves, their rifles flashing in the dim light. Elias dove behind a fallen log, returning fire with deadly precision, while Jonah scrambled for cover, cursing. They were surrounded. Marris's mocking laugh cut through the chaos, his voice carrying like poison. "Boone, you always were predictable. Thought you could chase me into my own den? This forest belongs to me now, and so will that little girl." Elias's jaw tightened, his breath steady despite the storm of bullets. "You'll never touch her," he growled under his breath. Sighting and dropping one of Marris's men with a single clean shot. Jonah fired beside him, taking down another, but their odds were grim. Moving with silent fury, Elias began to flank the attackers, weaving through the trees like a ghost, each shot from his revolver cutting their numbers. Marris shouted orders, rage creeping into his voice as his carefully laid trap unraveled. Jonah's shout rang out as one of the gang tried to circle behind them, but Elias was faster, tackling the man into the snow and ending the fight with a knife thrust. Blood steamed against the white ground, the smell of powder and iron thick in the freezing air. Marris cursed, his silhouette appearing at the far edge of the clearing, dark coat whipping in the wind. Their eyes locked across the distance, two men bound by loss and hatred. Marris raised his rifle and fired, the shot grazing Elias's side, tearing through cloth and flesh. Pain seared hot and sharp, but Elias didn't falter. He rose, relentless, returning fire even as Marris retreated deeper into the trees. When the last of the gang lay silent, Jonah ran to Elias, his face pale. "You're bleeding bad," he hissed, trying to steady him. Elias shoved Jonah's hands away, his voice like iron. "This ends now. No more graves. No more running." Together they mounted and plunged after Marris, the storm-gray eyes of the quiet cowboy burning with unbreakable resolve. Snow fell heavier as they rode, erasing tracks almost as fast as they were made, but Elias didn't need tracks anymore. He could feel Marris's presence ahead like a shadow in his soul, and he swore to the silent forest that before nightfall, one of them would never rise again. The snow thickened into a curtain of white, swallowing sound and sight, until Elias and Jonah were riding through a ghost world, every tree a looming figure, every shadow a threat. Marris's trail was nearly gone, but Elias didn't need his eyes to follow it. He could feel the man's presence like a poison in the wind, the same way a wounded wolf senses its hunter. Jonah rode close behind, muttering that they were too exposed, but Elias gave no reply. His storm-gray eyes locked ahead, his jaw a hard line of vengeance and grief. A flash of movement cut through the haze, and then a shot rang out. Jonah's horse screamed and went down, throwing him into the snow as Marris burst from the trees on a black stallion, firing wildly. Elias rolled from his saddle, returning fire in a blur of motion. The black horse reared as Marris dove clear, disappearing into the maze of pines. Jonah shouted that he was fine, though limping, and urged Elias to go. With a curt nod, Elias plunged alone into the heart of the storm, moving like a shadow among shadows. The world narrowed to the rhythm of his breathing, the crunch of snow beneath his boots, and the pounding of his heart. Marris's laughter floated through the trees, cruel and taunting. "Boone, you always thought you could bury the past, but you can't bury me." Elias's grip on his revolver tightened, his mind flashing to Lily's face, her last terrified scream, and Grace's trembling blue eyes. "This ends tonight," he growled, his voice swallowed by the storm. A flicker of movement to his left. Marris sprang from cover, tackling Elias to the ground. They rolled in a violent blur, fists and boots and snarling breath, the revolver skidding across the ice. Marris struck like a madman, years of hate fueling every blow, but Elias fought with the quiet strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. Snow turned red beneath them as knives flashed, each strike met with desperate blocks. Marris slammed Elias's head against the frozen ground, gloating through gritted teeth that Lily had begged for mercy before the flames consumed her. That lie ignited a fire deeper than rage. Elias roared, surging upward with a strength born of love and loss, reversing their positions and pinning Marris beneath him. The fight became primal. No weapons, just raw fury and survival. Marris clawed at Elias's wounded side, but Elias drove his fist into the man's scarred face again and again until Marris's laughter turned to screams. In the distance, Jonah's voice called out, but Elias barely heard it. Marris shoved him off with a last burst of strength and staggered to his feet, grabbing the fallen revolver. He aimed at Elias, panting, a wild gleam in his eyes. "You'll die like she did," he hissed. Elias rose slowly, blood dripping into the snow, his storm-gray eyes cold as steel. "No," he said, his voice calm and final. "This time, the fire dies with you." Marris pulled the trigger. but the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. Elias didn't hesitate. His shot rang out sharp and true, striking Marris square in the chest. The outlaw staggered, disbelief twisting his face before he collapsed into the snow, the storm quickly covering him in a white shroud. Elias stood over the body, chest heaving, the weight of years lifting and crashing down all at once. Jonah stumbled into the clearing moments later, wide-eyed and breathless. Elias didn't speak, just turned toward the faint glow of the valley below where Grace waited. With Marris dead, the long winter of blood and sorrow was finally breaking, and though Elias's heart still carried scars, he knew a new dawn was coming, one he would fight to protect with every breath he had left. The storm began to fade as Elias and Jonah trudged back through the forest, their boots crunching softly over the snow, Marris's lifeless body left behind beneath its cold white blanket. The silence felt strange after the chaos of battle, broken only by the soft whistle of the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. Elias walked ahead, his broad shoulders bowed beneath the weight of exhaustion, his storm-gray eyes fixed on the dim glow of Jonah's ranch in the valley below. Marris was dead, but the shadow he'd cast still lingered in Elias's mind, a tangle of rage and grief that would never fully vanish. Jonah limped beside him, blood seeping from a cut above his brow, but his voice held steady as he muttered that the world would be safer now, though they'd both carry scars that no storm could wash away. Elias didn't answer, his silence speaking louder than words. As they descended the ridge, the faint sound of hooves reached them, and Elias froze, hand instinctively going to his revolver. Relief surged through him when he saw Martha riding hard with two of Jonah's men, Grace bundled in front of her on the saddle, her small face peeking out from beneath a quilt. When Grace spotted Elias, she let out a cry that cut through the cold morning air, wriggling free to run toward him through the snow. Elias dropped to his knees, catching her in his arms, his breath shuddering as he held her close. She clutched the ring tied to her wrist and whispered through tears, "I knew you'd come back." For the first time in years, Elias allowed a small, broken smile to touch his lips. "I promised Lily I'd protect you," he murmured, his deep voice rough with emotion. "And I keep my promises." Back at the ranch, Jonah's men tended to wounds while Martha prepared food and warmth. Grace never left Elias's side, her tiny hand gripping his coat like an anchor. As the fire crackled, Jonah sat heavily at the table, pouring whiskey into 2 cups. "To Lily," he said quietly, lifting one toward Elias. Elias stared into the flames, memories of his bride's laughter and the smell of wildflowers filling his mind, then clinked his cup softly against Jonah's. "To Lily," he echoed, his voice breaking. After a long silence, Jonah asked what Elias planned to do now that Marris was gone. Elias's gaze shifted to Grace, who had fallen asleep curled in a blanket by the hearth, her breathing soft and steady. "Marris stole my future once," Elias said, his tone steady and low. "But he won't steal hers. This ranch will be her home now. She'll grow up knowing safety, not fear." Before dawn, Elias carried Grace outside to the clearing where Marris's men had burned Lily's family home years ago. The charred timbers were buried beneath snow, but their memory lived on like a scar. Grace woke slowly, shivering, and asked why they'd come here. Elias knelt beside her, brushing the snow away to reveal a small, blackened stone, the hearthstone from Lily's home. He placed the ring in Grace's palm, closing her fingers around it. "This was your sister's dream," he said softly. "Now it's yours to protect." Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she whispered that she'd make Lily proud. Elias gathered her close, a fierce promise burning in his chest. As they walked back toward Jonah's ranch, the first light of sunrise painted the snow in hues of gold and crimson, chasing away the last shadows of night. Elias paused at the ridge, looking back one final time. The past would always be there, ashes beneath the snow, but ahead lay a future worth fighting for. Grace slipped her hand into his, and together they stepped into that future, leaving the ghosts of Marris and Lily's tragedy behind. Elias knew he would never again be only a quiet rancher. He was now a guardian, and Grace's laughter would be the song that guided him through every storm to come. The sun climbed higher over Jonah's valley, turning the snow into a sea of glittering diamonds as Elias guided Grace toward the ranch house. Each step felt like a bridge between the nightmare of the past and the fragile hope of a new beginning. Behind them, the trail they'd traveled was already vanishing beneath a fresh layer of snow, as if the land itself wanted to erase the blood and sorrow of Marris's reign. Jonah stood waiting on the porch, his hat held respectfully in his hands. His face, weathered by years of hard living, softened as he looked at Grace, her small hand clutching Elias's calloused fingers. "She's safe now," Jonah said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Elias gave a single nod, storm-gray eyes glimmering with something deeper than words. Inside, Martha had prepared a warm meal, the smell of fresh bread and stew filling the air, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness Elias had carried in his heart for so long. Grace sat at the table, cheeks flushed with warmth, while Elias stood silently in the doorway, watching her eat. She looked up at him with Lily's same blue eyes and whispered, "Thank you for coming back for me." His throat tightened, memories of Lily's laughter and the night of the fire threatening to overwhelm him. He crouched beside Grace and placed the gold ring gently into her small hand. "This was your sister's," he said, his deep voice steady though his chest ached. "It belongs to you now. She wanted you to live, to grow, to never be afraid again, and I swear no one will ever hurt you as long as I draw breath." Grace threw her arms around his neck, and Elias held her close, the weight of his vow settling like iron in his soul. Later, when she had drifted into sleep beside the fire, Jonah joined Elias outside beneath the pale winter sun. They stood in silence for a long moment, looking over the valley, before Jonah finally spoke. "Marris's gang is broken. You've given this land back its peace, Elias. But what about you? What comes next?" Elias's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the distant mountains rose like sentinels. "I've been living in the past for too long," he said quietly. "Lily's gone, but Grace is here and she needs a future. I'll build it for her, with my own hands if I have to. This ranch will be hers, a place where laughter replaces screams." Jonah nodded, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You won't do it alone. You've got me, and you've got this whole valley behind you." As dusk approached, the townsfolk gathered at the ranch to honor Lily's memory and celebrate Grace's survival. Lantern light cast a warm glow over the snow as neighbors brought food, tools, and kind words, their presence weaving a net of community around the broken family. Elias stood slightly apart, his usual quiet demeanor hiding the storm of gratitude in his heart. When asked to speak, he simply lifted Grace into his arms and said, "She's safe. That's all that matters." The crowd erupted in cheers, a sound of life and hope echoing through the cold night. Later, beneath the rising moon, Elias walked alone to the clearing where Lily's home had once stood. He knelt, placing the last of the wildflowers Grace had gathered onto the blackened hearthstone, a silent tribute to the woman who had sacrificed everything. As he rose, the wind carried the faintest whisper of Lily's voice, not of sorrow, but of peace. Elias turned back toward the ranch where Grace's laughter rang out, steady and bright. He knew that while ghosts would always walk beside him, they no longer ruled him. The quiet rancher had found his purpose, not vengeance, but guardianship. And as long as he drew breath, Grace would never face the darkness alone. With the first stars glittering overhead, Elias Boone walked into the house where a new family waited, leaving the past buried beneath the snow forever.